In the news on Friday was a story about the rise of unions in this country, which is a perfect story for Labor Day weekend. So perfect that I had already planned that topic for my sermon. They even touched on some of the points I was planning to make, connecting our current time with the history of the labor movement, showing how the balance of power has shifted over time, especially in the last few years, and the hopefulness for our future that comes with labor actions. What they left out, and what I want to emphasize, is the importance of relying on each other. Unions aren't individuals, they're collectives. And because we know that the only way we can make things better is to make change together. I don't know about you, but about 3 years ago, I had a lot of time on my hands. A lot of time to consider what I missed when everything was closed down. Time to consider what it meant to be isolated from the community of people that held me through many times in my life. I had time to consider and learn and experience so much in those months that felt so long. One of the topics that caught my attention was how folks dealt with the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic. What could we learn that folks 100 years ago who lived through and processed the same stuff, what did we learn from them? Something I found fascinating, though, was how little folks in the years following talked about the pandemic or made any kind of reference to just how many people in the US had died in those 3 waves of flu. When we calculate for the population growth, the number of people who died from the flu in those 2 years would be close to 2.5 million people in our current numbers. I mean, the number of people in the US who've died from COVID-19 in the last 3 years is 1.19 million people. There are several theories about why folks didn't talk about it, but what I think is most likely and the most true is that folks were just too tired, worn down from the war that had just ended, and overwhelmed by the already huge numbers of young men killed in combat. In 1918, the Great War, later called World War I, was just ending. The modern warfare was so devastating, brutally killing so many soldiers, as well as deeply traumatizing the survivors. The population had been through so much, and they were still in the beginnings of that grief when the flu hit them and started to spread across the globe. The new culture of mass transportation and mass entertainment made it even easier to spread the virus. With all that loss, it was hard to wrap their heads around how drastically the culture had to shift and how drastically life would be different without that many people. With all the losses that we've experienced, it's hard to wrap our heads around how drastically our culture is about to shift. One of the things that have shifted in the last couple of years is the balance of power in labor movement. I'm particularly interested in the ways that our union movements echo the union movements also coming at the tail end of that Spanish flu. Some of the factors that made it possible for the unions to be effective with their actions 100 years ago are the same today. The post-war labor force was working to keep some of the protections that were in place because of the war, but they also had more leverage because there were so many fewer workers. Joshua Freeman wrote in an article in the Jacobin in April of 2020, World War I gave workers an unusual edge because of the severe labor shortage created by demands of the war production and the cutoff of immigration. The coronavirus is giving workers an edge because they hold the moral high ground. This is when workers were walking off the job or stopping work because of the lack of protections for COVID protections. When he predicted Joshua predicted that more labor actions would be coming over the next years as the outcomes of the pandemic became more obvious, and he was right. Today, the labor force has much more leverage because there are fewer workers. Partly this is from the loss of lives from COVID, but it's also from the numbers of folks who are now no longer able to work because of long COVID, and the numbers of families who can no longer afford childcare, so one of the working parents needs to give up their work to stay home with the children. There's also the fact that extreme wealth inequality that was prevalent in the beginning of the labor movement back in the late 1800s is also present today. Todd Vachin, an assistant professor in the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations, told the Associated Press that back then they had the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, and today we have Musk and Bezos. It's a similar period of transition and change, and also of resistance, of working people wanting to have some kind of dignity. The radical thrust of labor action in 1919 and 1920 reflected a worldwide sense that the war had disastrously demonstrated the moral and political bankruptcy of ruling elites and opened the possibilities for new ways of organizing society. I think we're seeing that right now. People are looking at a destabilized world economy, looking at the rise of fascism, looking at the extreme wealth, and seeing that something needs to be done. Something needs to change. In 1919, a strike wave began where fed-up union workers began to take action. Workers in many different parts of the country in many different types of work called for strikes for better working conditions, for better wages, for reasonable working hours. There was even a general strike where many people from different jobs but in similar industries stopped work to be in solidarity with workers who were striking. Both the flu and the strike wave were manifestations of the breakdown of the existing order, argued Joshua Freeman in 2020. Perhaps, he writes, like in World War I, the coronavirus, in unmasking the failures of the old order, may result in a new wave of activism. If this is the best we can do, the time has come to try something radically different, he said. And it is. The truth is that everything is already changing. Culture is shifting, and we're so deep in the middle of it that we may not even be able to see it. We have inklings like rising union actions across the country, like changing gender norms and fluidity, like changing family norms and expectations. The way we've always done it, no matter what it is, isn't working anymore. Sometime soon, we're going to need to show up to listen to those who are changing things to find out how we fit in the picture. There are lessons to be learned from the workers coming together to form a union, and there are lessons to be learned from the pandemic of the last century. Lessons we should have learned 100 years ago, some, but that we keep forgetting. Like, we're more than individuals. We are collectives. And somehow folks in the US keep forgetting that when things that we do, the things that we do individually help as a collective, benefit everyone. If people would have listened and trusted the public health officials in the early 1900s, fewer lives would have been lost. If people in 2021, myself included, stayed wary of the virus, we wouldn't have the most COVID deaths of any country in the world. I had to take a break from writing after I wrote that sentence. Let's take a breath together because that's a really big statement to take in. We have the most COVID deaths of any country in the world. I've seen it in myself This tendency to downplay the losses. They did the same thing after the flu pandemic. The deep desire to get back to normal, whatever that means, even as the new cases rise around us. I have so easily dropped the habit of wearing a mask that I forgot to put a new supply in my purse when I switched purses last week. So how do we live into the changes that are happening all around us without minimizing the recent past? How do we practice the lessons we've learned from the pandemic and from the labor movement? First lesson I want us to learn and remember and practice is about community care. Choosing to come together or stay apart to protect each other, to feed, house, and clothe each other, and to stop working to strike with each other to force those in power to hear our needs. We also want to learn the lessons of changing society enough to shift governmental power towards serving the many instead of the few. There are lessons here as well for our church work. Things are changing and will continue to change in ways we can't predict or control. How will we show up for those who need us? How will we honor the needs of people who can't even walk in the door yet? How do we tell young families that they're welcome in ways that they can feel in their bones? How do we shift church life to honor what has come before, serve those who are with us, and make the possibility of a bright and shining future a reality? The biggest cultural shift that I know is present in folks my age. We're learning that we need to put in as much as we take out of something. I'm thinking particularly about an opinion piece in the Washington Post in the last couple of weeks. I don't know, you may have read it, where the author is longing for a church for non-Christians. Yes, he's tried but we were too white, too upper middle class, and there wasn't the kind of programming that he wanted for his family, particularly midweek gatherings. That's my description of it, of course. I was flabbergasted because I think that's who we are, a church for non-Christians, particularly those who have been raised Christian but are open to the nones, people who have not been raised in congregations or are not currently attending, and Jews and Buddhists and Muslims and Hindus. We're folks who want to be diverse, who want to have programs for families with children on weeknights. We are a faith that requires you to ask questions and be interested in the answers. All we're missing, in his eyes, are the perfect mix of people and the programs that can bring those people together. Okay. Luckily, one of my amazing colleagues, the Reverend Casey Slack, wrote a response that was included in the paper this weekend. They said, okay, let me rephrase it for you because it was long. And they said, if you want a church like that, we're here. We're ready for you to come and help make it happen, and bring your friends. Because the people make the church. If the author brought their friends and put in the effort to make more programs happen, then they could come and enjoy those programs with their kids. But if all they want is for an organization to already have what they need and want without putting any work in, well, that's kind of a consumerist way of being, and that's not how churches work. Like the folks here did 30 years ago, if you want to make a church, you invite your friends and you make it happen. And then you invite some more friends and more folks until suddenly there's a whole building, a whole culture that's holding that church with you. I get it, I really do. We are all worn out and worn down by this pandemic, and that seems like it's never going to end. And it's too much to take on the task of keeping a church going all by ourselves. But when we work together, when we share the burden, the work is easier and more fun. We are better together. Many steps make a path, many stones make an arch, and many drops of water turn the mill. Together, we are mighty.